and that say that in my memory, Geraldine Doogue has championed the voice of lay people in our church over many years, even back in a time when it wasn't always appreciated. She has certainly put out into the deep. Tonight, we are privileged to have you with us, Geraldine, and we welcome you to the podium.
So, look, thank you very much indeed, and my respects to the Ngunnawal people and their elders, past and present, and ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. It's lovely to be here with such a big group. It is. It's absolutely wonderful. And I'm going to attempt to do justice to this demanding question you've asked me. But I'm going to start with a devastating quote. Have things ever seemed worse for the Catholic Church in Australia? If it were a boxer, it would look tangled on the ropes, sliding towards the canvas, spitting blood. The past 4 years have been horrendous. Endless, horrifying accounts of historical child abuse. A Royal Commission relentlessly critiquing failures of bishops and processes. The media baying for yet more blood. And now a report from the Commission eviscerating the Catholic sacrament of confession. How much worse can this get? Was the plea of Professor Greg Craven, the VC of the Australian Catholic University, in the Weekend Australian earlier this year. Some of you may have seen it. Now, that seemed to me a classic Holy Saturday question, if I can put it like that, posed legitimately by a struggling, shocked, ashamed people, Greg being a representative, trying to discern our next direction, which is what you've invited me to consider, I'm delighted to say. And I like it because it takes me beyond those ghastly lists of things that are dreadful, and what it engenders in me. It invites me to be constructive, which is a pleasure. So I'll offer you something of a counter to those statements. A wonderful poem from Australian literature. When you climb out a black well, you are not the same. You come to in the blue air with a long, sore scar circling your chest like the shoreline of a deep new sea. Your hands are webbed, inviting you to trust yourself in water stranger and wilder than you've ever known. Your heart has a kick. Your eyes have a different bite. You have emerged from some dark wonder you can't explain. You are not the same. Now, they're the memorable words of the late Australian poet Dorothy Porter in a poem called Not the Same. And I'd like to suggest that this does offer us, indeed, some psychological, even spiritual roadmap to trust that we can indeed emerge, but not on exactly the same terms. Maybe we have to wait a bit. We've been talking about this at our table. Maybe we just do have to pause and reflect on where we are as people who may or may not have devoted a lot of time to this institution, and our thoughts may not be particularly coherent. There's a great line from St. Teresa of Avila's that I love. At the outset of her classic work, The Way of Perfection, she confesses, "Since I don't know what I am to say, I cannot say it in an orderly way." And I am struggling mightily with what to say, what to feel, what to think. And I'm not trying to be trivial here, but I presume there are a lot of people who've devoted their lives to, say, the Commonwealth Bank, who might feel in a similar sort of situation in terms of having given themselves, in all honesty and in all conscientiousness, to this big beast institution, only to discover a whole lot of very wrong things happening around them. Didn't they notice? Should they have? And believe me, with the sort of disruption swirling around a range of institutions, including one I know well, another big meaning institution, the ABC, I can tell you we're not alone. In some ways it's a very Darwinian time, survival of the fittest, which I don't recommend. And it's certainly not the heritage that I was brought up with, the Catholic heritage, which is the reverse of that. But that is where we are, and we have to work within it with as much virtue as possible. Now, you might say, but of course what the Catholic Church is going through is a different order, the Church's dark night of the soul, and I couldn't disagree with you. Many of us knew this institution as something that was utterly precious, that was sort of singular in its drawness, that offered us a glimpse of the divine. Nothing else did that. Although for all of that, we might have taken it quite a bit for granted, and that's what I'll come to in a moment. Someone was running it, weren't they? You know, it'd keep turning somehow, wouldn't it? We'd turn up, we'd do our thing, we'd offer a little bit, knowing that someone else was doing the main thing. It was like our personal circulation system. Its flaws were obvious to us, but we knew they were outweighed by its faith, hope and charity. Plus we did know, I've really reflected on this, we knew our church truly represented far more than the awful stories dominating the headlines. We knew, for instance, that 700,000 school children were educated in the Catholic sector, served by 82,000 staff. 66 hospitals, including 19 public hospitals, were run by church-related entities, surely massive hubs of compassion. And that the Vincent de Paul was the biggest single provider of charity services, compassion services, outside the government. And I sometimes have reflected elsewhere, some of those particularly vulnerable people who went to the Royal Commission will need the services of those very institutions. So, we'd better keep them going. So, where does my Holy Saturday style thinking take me? Well, towards your explicit invitation to think towards the next stage, to reimagine a modern faith community, knowing that we have lived within a community with some descent into depravity. Such a dreadful thing to say, but we know that is true in some part. Now, I had quite a powerful, if poignant experience at Mass in my local church recently in Sydney, listening to a young Australian Vietnamese priest who obviously was recently ordained, transparently devout and super conscientious. And his emphasis in his homily quite surprised me because it distilled something in me, I must say, because he saw himself, and his words, very clear, as leading, clearly the Good Shepherd, I suppose, as leading us, the people in the pews, through the thickets of life towards greater faith. And he said this several times, and then came this moment which actually brought tears to my eyes. And he leaned forward in this earnest way and he said, I pray every day, dear people, that I will be up to the task, that I will resist all temptations and fulfil my mission to you. And it was just so poignant because I felt myself, with my great age saying, as if a lot of those priests in the headlines didn't start out exactly the same as you. But look, what it did, I could see his total commitment. I, of course, was impressed by it. But I wanted him to say something like, instead, I will be there to accompany you, dear people. I will learn alongside you. I will walk alongside you. And I hope to never deviate as we all attempt together to discern God's path for us and for our church in the world, or something like that. That was the language I was seeking. I sometimes think it's really helpful to actually say in words what it is you'd like to hear, whether in a domestic or a broader situation, because then it really does reveal how you're thinking. Not sort of, describing a notion. Say what you want to hear. So that was quite a different perspective, I felt, to what I heard. It was a very different model of both priesthood and church. You may not have put it the same way, but that's how I would put it. His quite definite emphasis made me realise how I had shifted, possibly by this crisis, but undoubtedly brewed originally in the documents of Vatican II and the whole notion of a pilgrim church. But truly, the only way forward for a thriving Catholic Church in Australia, as I see it, is an institution with much, much more collaboration, power and influence sharing and mutual respect between clergy and laity, lay people. between the officials and the non-ordained people. Now, this means a new laity. I fully acknowledge that. I'm going to focus on that tonight rather than on the clergy, because I think there's been a lot of talk about that. I'm going to go to the laity, to us. I expect real stepping up by us, lay people, in a way I don't think we've been prepared to. I expect reflection of a big order in terms of what's required, just like I'm asked to do on a weekly, if not daily basis at the ABC. I expect leadership training, innovative thinking, planning, as well as kindness and generosity of spirit. And to meet that, I'd hope for a humble readiness to adapt by clergy. Those who lead, have been leading, are fundamentally called to serve, as the truism goes. That great quote, I can't think who it is, I've tried to find it. The best leaders are those who are slightly behind their people, slightly behind their people. It's a very interesting model. And in trying to sort my way through, with my developing views through these last demanding years, I've sought out sources of hope and energy in surprising areas. I've realised that it requires both humility and perseverance to be useful, combined with a propensity to plan, not just to ponder. Not passivity, in other words, not surrender. Something more deeply bold, in fact. Bold. That's what the nuns used to accuse us of. Don't be bold, girls. We had a nun at Sister Mary Pascal, and they always used to say when Carmen Lawrence, you know, who was that member for whatever she was, Fremantle, came to the House of Representatives, she had no fear of the House of Representatives because she had coped and survived Sister Mary Pascal at Santa Maria College. But yes, that word bold has come to me. I'd like to quote a German writer, the deputy editor-in-chief of Der Spiegel, the German magazine, and his name is Dirk Kerpjeweit. He's been in Australia this year. He appeared on my program Saturday Extra, no longer Life Matters, Saturday Extra now, speaking about the modern German mood post their 20th century cataclysms, their shame, their absolute diving into the dust. This is what he said. Germans once believed they'd found a saviour, but then he tried to destroy the world, and now their belief in salvation has vanished. The sociologist Helmut Schelsky found there was a sceptical generation of Germans who took part in the war when they were very young and who then went on to build up the Federal Republic of Germany. They rejected all grand ideas. Their state religion, this is a fascinating thing, became Karl Popper, the philosopher's piecemeal social engineering, the politics of small measures. Turn a screw here, carefully open a valve there, make sure not to create too much hope. Extraordinary statement. That's Angela Merkel's fundamental approach, and we all know she hasn't exactly had the easiest of fortnight, but it looks like she is stitching together a coalition. But in other words, people at the very bottom of their experience, could it have been any more annihilating for the Germans? They worked their way back. And I've often thought, it might sound dramatic, but I've often thought, how did they do that? And look where they are. The only, really, in some ways, island of stability at the moment in the world that we compare ourselves with. Now, they worked their way back from the bottom of the barrel. And I've also turned to another group that might surprise you, the world of Judaism and the Jewish people, to see whether their experience offers us real guidance in this dark night time. After all, they truly had to recreate their entire belief and cultural structure not long after the time of Jesus, when the Romans destroyed their second temple, and their whole hierarchy, their kings, their prophets, their priests, their freedom. It was simply impossible to continue as was. It's amazing history. I had to read up on it properly when I went to the Holy Land recently, and it's really quite illuminating. And of course, in our own times, the Holocaust is one of the terrible scars of the 20th century, which again tested them to their core. Now, one of the guiding principles of that community's strength, here and overseas, is summarised by a wonderful phrase that I offer to you that the former UK Chief Rabbi, Jonathan Sacks, articulated. His emphasis was the invitation to belong before believing. Belonging before believing. I find that incredibly inviting. I find it very helpful. Now, I'm not stupid. I don't believe you can just transpose one belief tradition's whole mores onto another's. But as the London Tablet editorialised recently, and I think it's absolutely right, there's a fundamental continuity between Jewish hope and Christian hope. The Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and I'll quote them here, are conjoined narratives of hope. Each looks towards the same ending to the human story, when God will take his own to himself. Thy kingdom come is both a Jewish and a Christian prayer of hope. Not a passive hope, because the kingdom, however you read that, has to be built. It has to be just and at peace. The lion must lie down with the lamb. The Sermon on the Mount is the template. But the faithful are the builders. It's not a bit of magic from above. I have several very good Jewish friends, very active in their community, and I've been incredibly impressed, and I've quietly watched them. And I sought them out when you asked me to speak, to learn more about the way their community is structured, where the life lies. That's why I said to them, I want to know where the life lies. Now, they're a much tighter cultural group, and that's different to us. I accept that again. The Catholic Church is the original multinational entity, wondrous in its breadth. I've always thought not so easy when you're going through the type of crisis that we're going through in Australia, because to some extent we're on our own here, to some extent. Discerning a rescue that makes sense to our Australian sensibilities and to our children and grandchildren, so that it's not the riches of our tradition aren't just consigned to a museum. Rabbi Sacks writes beautifully about this, and he distilled a particular approach to adapting a belief tradition when he received the lucrative Templeton Prize for Religion last year. And again, I found it very helpful, and I offer it to you. What emerged, he wrote, in Judaism and post-Reformation Christianity was the rarest of character types, the inner-directed personality. Most societies, for most of history, have been either tradition-directed or other-directed. People do what they do either because that's how they've always been done or because it's what other people do. Inner-directed types are different. They become the pioneers, the innovators, the survivors. They have an internalised sat-nav system so that they aren't fazed by uncharted territory. They have a strong sense of duty to others. They try to have secure marriages. They hand on their values to their children. They belong to strong communities. They take daring but carefully calculated risks. When they fall, they have rapid recovery times. They play it long. They play it long. They are more interested in sustainability than quick profits. Cultures like that stay young. They defeat the entropy, the loss of energy that has spelled the decline and fall of every other empire and superpower in history. Now, you may think, yes, well, look, that's the chief rabbi speaking, so obviously he's massively embedded in their recoveries and, he's right at the centre of everything, just as our archbishops have been, cardinals, etc., etc. But no. As I understand it anyway, this is not actually how it works. I mean, there are all sorts of different traditions of Judaism and they go ahead, they sally forth knowing that, but some dominant ones in Australia where the rabbis and shul are still essentially the symbolic core and known to be, but as I understand it, and I'll be argued with later, the real locus of energy and commitment is in secular Jewry, benefiting the individuals concerned and the health of their community. Now, it's true they don't explicitly, except in some particular areas like interfaith, say, and refugee work, they don't aim to penetrate the wider community, which we do in our Catholic tradition. I think it's one of our great strengths. But as my friends say, when I ask this question, where does the life lie? And it makes such sense. Jews have to enable their own group to survive because they know no one else will do it. And actually, I think that's quite pertinent. If you look at the sort of hostility that is we're meeting at the moment. So they simply had to work out what's required or go down with a ship. And they suggested to me that the maintenance of doctrine as such was less emphasised or worried about. What preoccupied them was engagement, and over various age groups, engagement. In fact, rabbis associated with Jewish schools, have titles and are said to be responsible for Jewish life. It's actually stated, which I found very interesting indeed. It's a broader concept, subtle maybe, but I think it is, compared with the brief for our chaplains. And I find this quite thought-provoking and definitely living out that dictum of belonging before believing. They set up groups like Jewish Community of Australia, JCA, Council of Jewish Women, let alone their very much better known groups like Jewish Board of Deputies or B'nai B'rith. They're very well funded, and this is an important issue. And I've brought along with me a document that the Jesuits did a lot of research in Melbourne, and I went to one of their conferences earlier this year. And I was just looking through it again, and just the need for regular, confident sources of money, if we're going to really empower the laity, is a very important issue. But these groups aim to support activities, this was another very interesting thing, that embody the values of Judaism more than stated beliefs. Now, of course, we do that too. Gosh, what could Vincent de Paul be other than that? But I do wonder whether we could articulate this better, especially to younger members, to display a confidence in the values base and its roots, which I think we're actually all really quite sure about. But we've got all woolly about it. I'm not sure whether we should say it. I think we should persuade people that... I should go on. They were saying, that it's important to display a confidence to younger people in this values base, that the projects chosen by these different groups were understandable, not abstract, based more on action than explicit and stated beliefs, well run and sustainable to encourage younger talented people to take part. Persuade people, this is what they see as their mission statement, that Jewish community vibrancy is in their individual and their family interest, and to encourage engagement before fundraising. Now, I also think the Jewish tradition of eating together on a Friday night for a Shabbat meal is just genius. But I can't see how that can be easily replicated, but I just invite you all to dwell upon it a little bit. It's so smart. And that again came out of very much their dark night of the soul. And of course, it just all helped this repositioning of power, influence and confidence. But I think it is very affirming too in a collective sense, very anti-loneliness, which is the great needs. It's personal. It exposes people to their spiritual and cultural base. It has the potential to be fun. That's a word. But of course, they'd also say to me there are plenty of Shabbat refugees sort of eating out and having dinner in Double Bay away from their families. They reminded me, don't get too carried away with Shabbat. And there's a lot of them practice it, a lot of them don't. But in fact, this issue of sheer friendship that I think Shabbat does represent, having been invited along to several, is another area receiving some very good writing from American Catholics. Even though we have, with good reason, a synod on the pastoral care of the family, I think I do agree with some observers that the Church should probably balance its emphasis on family with one on friendship. That great need in our times of digital times, of friending on Facebook, with us still trying to discern what that means. And I think it's very interesting and rich territory, this. All, again, I would suggest to you, part of this emphasis on believing, belonging before believing. I mean, Pope Francis wrote about exactly this in Evangelii Gaudium, and that he lamented the widespread loss of a sense of friendship with Christ. And it permeates that wonderful document, which had quite an impact on me when I went to the Broken Bay Diocese that Phil and I met at, because it really challenges us to reframe. If you read it, honestly, it is worth it. It's long, but it's really worth it to reframe our Christian thinking. And he has a great line from it. There are Christians whose lives seem like Lent without Easter. Such a devastating line. It was the most startling challenge to me personally. He warned against defeatism, that we couldn't leave it to the professionals, and that we had to navigate the way forward. We had to forge more unity with our communities. We had to re-examine our structures completely. And don't delay, he said, in examining the church's role in your modern life. Don't fall back on the excuse of what you consider non-negotiable foes of being too busy or being put off by the clergy, or because you find a sterile pessimism, another great line, that you don't feel capable of breaking through. Again, the London tablet's worth accessing for their parish practice section, a section which I strongly recommend to you. They put it this way, which I loved. Respect the busyness of the lives of those in your parish and affirm the many ways in which the busy life is made holy. One of their terrific nuns, Gemma Simmons, pleaded for a language development that would speak of spirituality in a way that would be accessible to the contemporary world. Maybe 5 minutes of time alone with the will of God amidst the 24/7 calls. But by and large, she suggested there was no real guidance for the church on this score. Although you might, like me, use the Irish Jesuits' marvellous Sacred Space little moment of meditation that you can get online, which is just absolutely fantastic. So I do think, however, my Jewish friends would say, just do it. Don't worry, don't think about it, don't think too deeply. It's quite a challenge. I'm just throwing it out because I asked them and I've observed them, and this is what they came back to me with. Show it can be done, and then the words will come. Young people, they say, want it obvious, and they'll draw the conclusions, thank you very much, which is tricky and demanding territory. Pope Francis praises the benefits of the parish with its rich vitality. This is our traditional structure. He doesn't want people to be nomads without roots, another great phrase, because he thinks it's anti-hope. It's like a drift, a mood or an attitude which can so easily lead to fear, which can lead to demagoguery and toxicity, the very reverse of the discernment required for citizens to live in a marvellous open society like ours. But I think the point is, I suppose I'm trying to suggest, I know there'll be no neat, easy answers with killer blow policies that just follow. But I feel that we have to start thinking outside our established mannerisms.